Hello, and welcome to the Texas Maritime Museum. I'm Dr. Justin Parkoff, the Executive Director. Our mission is to educate and excite the public about maritime history and its importance to the development and current livelihood of our great state. Our exhibits focus on several narratives, including early Native American Karankawa coastal trade, Spanish, failed French expeditions, and American colonization. The Texas Navy period, which was so crucial to our development as a republic, Western River steamboat cotton trade and navigation, ship construction. Soon, future exhibits will include the numerous sea battles that took place all along our coast during the American Civil War, Union's extensive blockade of Texas. It's amazing how many shipwrecks we have right off our own shore that most people don't know about, and that we are trying to educate about and preserve. As the official accredited museum of Texas, as approved by the Texas State Legislature, the Texas Maritime Museum works closely with the Texas Navy Association, the state's Texas Historical Commission, the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, and other educational institutions such as the Center for Maritime Archaeology and Conservation at Texas A&M University. By working with these entities, the Texas Maritime Museum offers engaging maritime experiences that promote equality, accessibility for a diverse environment that is interactive to both children and adults alike. We look forward to having you visit with us on your next visit to Rockport, Texas. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is David Wetzel. I'm president of the Texas Navy Association. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Commodores, Pirates, and Politicians. The Texas Navy Defends the Republic, 1840 to 1843, presented by historian and author Jonathan Jordan. The Texas Navy Association is pleased to offer this program. We are grateful to our sponsors at the Texas Maritime Museum in Rockport, Texas for their generous support. The Texas Navy Association is a nonprofit education organization committed to promoting the history and the legacy of the Navy of the Republic of Texas between 1835 and 1846. Please visit our website, texasnavy.org, to learn more about the TNA and about becoming a member. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Admiral Jerry Patterson, past president of the Texas Navy Association, and the special governor's representative to the TNA Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Admiral Wetzel. Tonight, the Texas Navy brings you a webinar about the little-known, underappreciated, but heroic Texas Navy of 1836 to 1846. Our program is titled Commodores, Pirates, and Politicians. The Texas Navy Defends the Republic, 1840 to 1843. Our presenter is Jonathan W. Jordan, the award-winning author of Lone Star Navy, Texas, the Fight for the Gulf of Mexico and the Shaping of the American West. Among Mr. Jordan's other works are studies of the American and Allied high commands in World Wars I and II, and his recent work, published in 2020 and co-authored with his daughter, Emily Ann Jordan, War Queens, Extraordinary Women Who Ruled the Battlefield. Mr. Jordan is a native of Savannah, Georgia, and now resides in Atlanta, where he practices commercial litigation and bankruptcy law. He has an accounting degree from Sanford University in Birmingham, Alabama, and a law degree from Vanderbilt. He previously practiced law in Dallas, and he was commissioned an admiral in the Texas Navy by Governor Rick Perry. Now let's get underway. Admiral Jordan, you now have the helm.
Thanks, Jerry. In an earlier episode, we took a deep dive into the Texas Navy's signature battle, the Battle of Campeche, in May of 1843. In this episode, we'll step back in time for a closer look at the Navy of the Republic of Texas, known to history as the Second Texas Navy. This was the Navy that protected Texas. It was a time after the Revolution had been won, and Texas and its leaders had to learn how to move from hot-headed revolutionaries to responsible national statesmen. So let's move the clock back to the year 1838, a year and a half after independence had been won, and see what Texas was trying to do with the Navy. The first question we might ask is, where was Texas? How did it fit into its corner of the world? Well, Texas would shape and would be shaped by three nations: Mexico to the south, the United States to the north and east, and a collection of Native American tribes to the west. Mexico, the home country, is where we'll start. The loss of Texas was a national humiliation, so Mexico was going to be hostile to Texas no matter what. But Mexico was also internally unstable. The wave of states' rights passions that had impelled Texas to break away from Mexico City echoed in southern Mexico, in places like Yucatan and Tabasco, and in northern Mexico around the Rio Grande River. While Mexico was putting down these anti-government movements, it was too busy to do a whole lot about Texas. Well, if Mexico was hostile, the United States wasn't exactly helpful around this time. Towards the end of his presidency, Andrew Jackson extended diplomatic recognition to the Republic of Texas. But Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor as president, opposed Texas annexation because it would raise tensions with Mexico and it would add another slave state to the Union. Most Democrats did not want to stir up a political hornet's nest around slavery, so for the moment, Texas was on its own. To the west, the most feared Indians were probably the Comanches, but like other tribes, the Caddo, the Apache, Cherokee, and some others, they presented problems to settlers moving northwest from the little newly founded town of Austin. Now, there was one other country far from Texas, but it also affected the fate of Texas. The British Empire, a customer of Texas cotton, was in a tricky position in the 1830s. Queen Victoria's Britain wanted Texas to remain independent because England didn't want to have to climb over a U.S. tariff to buy Texas cotton, and because England didn't want its former colony, the United States, to grab Texas and become too powerful. But Great Britain also had a lot of investors with the Mexican government, and it was a trading partner of Mexico. So it didn't want to deliver any body blows to Mexico either. It had to walk a fine line. Well, that's where Texas was. But the second question we might ask is, what was Texas at the time, or what did it want to be? After the Texas Revolution, President Sam Houston was elected as president, and he held that office until the 1838 elections. Today, we think of Sam Houston as the brash, tough guy hero of San Jacinto, and he certainly was. But Houston was also a fiscal conservative, a unionist, and he wanted Texas to be set on a solid financial footing if it was going to survive, even temporarily, as a country. The military was expensive, it was hard to control, and it was provocative to Texas's neighbors, the Indians to the west and the Mexicans to the south. Houston wanted to avoid provoking either group, and he wanted to make sure Texas wasn't spending too much money. More farmers and fewer officers was one of Old Sam's mottos. But in December 1838, Mirabeau Lamar, Houston's cavalry commander at San Jacinto, was elected to succeed Houston. Lamar was the leader of what became the opposition anti-Houston party, and Lamar's policies were almost diametrically opposed to those of Sam Houston. Houston wanted to keep Texas politically inoffensive to its neighbors, to avoid expensive and bloody wars. But Lamar thought of Texas as possibly a regional power that might push its borders as far as the Pacific Ocean someday. But to do that, Texas would need a robust military capable of pushing out the Indians to the west and protecting her border with Mexico in the south. So at Lamar's urging, the Texas Congress appropriated $250,000 to buy a navy in the year 1839. Now, Texas needed a navy because it was mostly undefended, at least at sea. The 4 warships that formed the Navy of the Revolution had been lost by the fall of 1837. That meant that Mexico should have been able to launch an amphibious invasion to retake Texas by the end of Sam Houston's presidency. But Mexico couldn't do that. It was for 2 reasons. The first was Mexico's internal instability, which kept the government busy deploying troops here and there, putting down brush fires. The other reason was because of some French pastries. After Santa Anna was pushed out of power, Mexican President Anastasio Bustamante got Mexico into a war with France by refusing to compensate a French baker for confiscating a pantry full of chocolate eclairs. Well, if you know much about France, you know they take their pastries seriously, and France declared war and sent Admiral Charles Baudin with a fleet to attack Veracruz. The Mexican government recalled Santa Anna to lead the troops. He lost his leg in a battle, and the French fleet captured the Mexican fleet. And the matter wouldn't be resolved by diplomacy until 1839. Now, when we talk about what Texas was around this time, we have to look at its finances. Texas was basically broke. It had no foreign currency to speak of and no gold and silver reserves to back its money. The only thing it really had was lots of land. Under President Lamar, Texas began issuing paper money called redbacks, named after the color of the back of the paper. These were the 19th century equivalent of junk bonds. They were worth about 37 cents on the dollar when they were first issued, and as government debt swelled, investors devalued them and eventually stopped taking the redbacks altogether. Now, in 1837, the Texas Congress passed the Naval Act. It was an act calling for the acquisition of 6 warships. And before long, Texas agents in Baltimore entered into a contract with the shipbuilding firm of Frederick Dawson and Sons to build these 6 ships for a total of $280,000. The contract provided that if Texas did not pay the firm on time, it would have to pay a 100% penalty. So the guys at Frederick Dawson and Sons went to work on the ships, apparently not thinking that if Texas didn't have the money to pay them $280,000, it probably wouldn't have the money to pay $560,000 either. But on they went. Now, the first warship to reach Texas didn't come from Baltimore. In March of 1839, the elegant steamboat Charleston sailed into Galveston Bay. She was a passenger and mail steamer bought in Philadelphia and renamed Zavala, after the interim Texas Vice President Lorenzo de Zavala. Over the following winter, after going to New Orleans for extensive and expensive repairs, she returned to Texas in 1840 to prepare for her cruise against Mexico. When completed, Zavala probably had 8 guns. Sometimes guns were moved to other ships or to shore. But her real power wasn't in the number of cannons she had, it was her mobility. She could move at the very fast pace of 12 to 16 knots in good weather with her engines at full throttle. And with a good solid load of Pittsburgh coal, she could keep up ahead of steam in her engines for 25 days. Most importantly, those steam engines freed her from the caprice of the winds. She could maneuver whenever she wished, regardless of the direction of the winds, and she could tow bigger warships into firing position when the weather wasn't cooperating. As we'll see, that ability to defy the winds represented a priceless advantage in a naval battle. And Zavala was the most technologically advanced warship in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps in the entire world at the time. Next came the 3 saints, San Antonio, San Bernard, and San Jacinto. These were the 3 schooners originally named Asp, Scorpion, and Viper. San Antonio and San Bernard each had 6 12-pounder guns and 1 pivot gun amidships, so they could fire 4 guns in either direction. They were small vessels and were often commanded by a lieutenant rather than a captain. Their job was to act as scouts, messenger ships, and escorts for the fleet. and they had some advantages over the larger vessels like the sloops of war and the brigs. They could get closer into the shore because they only drew about 10 feet of water. They required fewer men to man them, and they were more maneuverable when the winds were against you. After the schooners were the next two vessels, the brigs. They were larger than schooners and generally carried about 16 guns apiece. The first brig was named the Brazos, after the river on which Sam Houston's capital stood. But the Texas government moved west to the city of Austin, so the brig was renamed Colorado, after the river on which Mirabeau Lamar's capital stood. Eventually, they changed the name again and renamed her the Wharton, after the Wharton brothers, who were early Texas diplomats. The second brig, named the Dolphin, was pretty much identical to her sister ship. She arrived in Galveston in April of 1840 and was renamed the Branch T. Archer, after Lamar's Secretary of War. The final member of the Second Texas Navy was its flagship, the 600-ton sloop of war Texas, soon renamed the Austin. A sloop of war is not the same thing as the single-masted small boat that we might see in a harbor today. The Austin was much larger than that. She had 3 masts and was the only Texas vessel that could properly be called a ship. She carried 20 guns, which were mostly 24-pounders, firing a 24-pound ball, and she had 2 long-range 18-pounders. Her full crew complement was 60 officers, 226 sailors, and 26 Marines. She was a very well-built ship, and she could move it up to 11 knots under an expert captain. And as we'll see, she had an expert captain. Now, these ships needed a lot of supplies, from kitchen utensils to gunpowder, from sail canvas to paint. One of the interesting items on the Navy Secretary's shopping list was the small arms for the Navy. The Marines and landing parties would need pistols, and the Texas Navy rescued a Connecticut gunmaker named Sam Colt from bankruptcy by purchasing 180 of his newfangled revolving 5-shot pistols. Mr. Colt was extremely grateful for the order, and in time those pistols would wind up in the hands of Captain Jack Hayes' Texas Rangers, who would use them at later battles like at Walker's Creek. Well, that brings us to the personnel of the Navy. It's one thing to buy ships and gunpowder, but operating all that weaponry is a very different story. It takes a lot of sailors, officers, suppliers, and administrators to run a Navy. So in 1839, President Lamar had to build up his Department of the Navy. Well, at the top of the civilian establishment was Lamar's first Secretary of the Navy, Memucan Hunt, a North Carolina-born diplomat. He was succeeded after just a few months by Lewis P. Cook, a New York Army volunteer who arrived in Texas just after the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, both Hunt and Cook were decent administrators who sympathized with the Navy. They believed in it. The problem was they didn't have a whole lot of money to work with. And like other Navy secretaries, they were sandwiched between the president at the very top and the naval commander. So they couldn't really do too much in their jobs except transmit orders from the president to the commodore in charge. Next on the totem pole came the head of the Naval Department, Commander John Grant Todd. A native of Lexington, Kentucky, Todd moved to Mexico in the late 1820s and enlisted in the Mexican Navy. Originally, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay got him a midshipman's appointment in the U.S. Navy, and Todd served with a lot of enthusiasm, but not a lot of skill. He failed his midshipman's examination 3 times, and finally, in 1836, the U.S. Navy permitted him to resign. Early the next year, the ex-midshipman heard rumors that Texas was building a fleet, and when Texas signed a contract for the construction of a squadron in Baltimore, he traveled there to the shipyards to help oversee the ship construction. Well, the most important position, commander of the fleet, still needed to be filled in early 1839. The last unquestioned commander of the fleet had been Captain George Wheelwright. He had been sacked by Sam Houston in April 1838. Since Captain Wheelwright's fall from grace, the fleet, which really only existed on paper, was commanded by a succession of lieutenants who had little to do but drink whiskey and make sure not too many naval supplies got stolen out of the Navy shed. But in the spring of 1839, President Lamar found a man who would check all the boxes and become the Texas Navy's leader for the rest of its colorful life, Post Captain Edwin Ward Moore. Edwin Moore was born in 1810 to one of the great families of Virginia. His grandfather had been a Revolutionary War officer wounded at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. An uncle fought in defense of Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. Young Edwin Moore attended Alexandria Academy, a school founded by his grandfather, and one of his schoolmates was a lad from Stratford Hall, Virginia, named Robert E. Lee. Moore entered the U.S. Navy as a midshipman in 1825 and gained a lot of experience over the next 13 years sailing small to medium warships in the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic, and the Gulf of Mexico. Moore was fluent in Spanish, a strong swimmer, great in conversation and diplomacy, and intellectually curious. He had led a landing party during the Seminole War, and by 1839 he held the rank of lieutenant and had earned the respect of men like John Grant Todd. There are no records, at least that I've been able to find, of when Lieutenant Moore sat down with President Lamar and what they talked about. But it must have been a good interview, because Lamar offered Moore the position sometime in March of 1839. This was a wonderful opportunity for Lieutenant Moore, because promotions in the U.S. Navy were glacial. Everything was done by seniority, so you had to wait for the guy in front of you to die to take his place. And there were still some officers from the War of 1812 hanging around. Moore accepted command of the Texas Navy around April 21st, 1839, and he took the rank of post captain, which today we would call the rank of captain. Now, it takes a lot of men to operate a warship. They have to keep the vessel safe in all types of weather, all day and all night, and they have to be able to fight the enemy at close range, at long range, in a boarding party, or on land. In 1839, Commodore Moore took the brig Colorado up to New York City on a recruiting trip for sailors, officers, and Marines. The American Neutrality Act of 1818 made it illegal to recruit sailors on American shores, but Commodore Moore somehow managed to stay under the radar as he lured men aboard with recruiting bonuses and promises of prize money. He got out of town just ahead of a military investigation and headed back to Galveston to distribute the new men among his ships. Well, before we get into the Texas Navy's operations from 1840 to 1843, I'd like to say a word about the ranks because they can be a bit confusing. The lowest rank aboard ship at the time is called a landsman. That's basically a landlubber who can work on the ship. He's not skilled in going up the yards and working the sails or the lines up top, which can be a dangerous job. Landsmen basically pull on the lines, they clean the decks, they move the cannons, and they do other jobs around the ship. They work the guns in combat along with the other sailors. The next level is the ordinary seaman, followed by the able seaman. These are the guys who do most of the actual work on the ship. The petty officers on any vessel are sort of a lower middle management. They oversaw the management of the sailors. There was also the commissioned officer class. Above seamen are the midshipmen, who are usually teenage boys who aspire to become officers. They did not have a commission yet, but if they pass their exams and have enough experience, they can go on to become lieutenants, who are the commissioned officers who run the watches or the shifts on the ship. Now, on small vessels, the smaller ships, the lieutenants can command the ship as a lieutenant commanding. And above them is the rank of master and commander, which is usually shortened to commander. So Commodore Moore's right-hand man, John T.K. Lothrop, was a commander, as was John Grant Todd. Well, the highest rank at the time in both the U.S. and Texas Navies was post captain, later shortened to just captain. Originally, a post captain was a guy who commanded a ship that had at least 20 guns. And in Commodore Moore's case, they originally didn't have a ship like that until the Austin arrived. But as we'll see, they got one and Commodore Moore put it to good use. Last couple of things on ranks. Back then, there were no admirals. The United States Navy thought that admirals sounded too much of a rank of royalty, like Great Britain had. So the top rank until 1862 was captain. A commodore was a courtesy title given to a commander of a squadron of ships, usually a dozen or fewer. Now, there were also warrant officers who had these specialized jobs and would never get promoted to lieutenant or captain or commander. These warrant officers included sailmakers, armorers, the purser, that's the guy who handled the money of the ship, boatswains, surgeons, gunners, and a few other types like that. The last category of inhabitant aboard a warship was the Marines. They were the guys whose job was to maintain law and order aboard ships, protect the officers from the sailors, and in combat, act as infantrymen. In the Texas Navy, the highest ranking Marine was a major, and usually on board ships, they were commanded by lieutenants or captains. So with the wooden ships and iron men all pulled together, by 1840, the Texas Navy was ready to make its first voyage to sea. But they had to get past some Austin politics before they could weigh anchor. As 1840 opened, the Fourth Texas Congress dealt President Lamar a string of political setbacks. It passed a bill that disbanded most of the Texas Army, and on February 5th, it put the Navy into ordinary, which we sometimes call mothballs. The law allowed President Lamar to ignore the mothballing of the Navy in the event of a national emergency. And President Lamar read newspaper accounts, some of which were accurate, that Mexico was in the process of buying warships so it could invade Texas once more. Now, President Lamar, for all of his anti-Mexican feeling, was intelligent enough to know that Mexico was a big place, and Texas had a lot of friends there as well as a lot of enemies. Lamar's enemy was the central government of Mexico City, and his friends were the Federalist rebels who wanted stronger local government control. This feeling was particularly high in the outlying regions, like Tabasco in the south, and the Mayan part of the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as northern parts closer to Texas. Now, Mirabeau Lamar figured that if he could keep Mexico's central government busy putting down rebellions across the country, Mexico wouldn't be able to invade Texas until Texas was too strong for it to subdue. This was particularly true in Yucatan. And so President Lamar told the Texas Congress, here's what he said, instead of unifying with the benighted, the corrupt, the priest-ridden portions of Mexico for our extermination, they, the Yucatecos, are themselves at war with a very power that withholds our rights and seeks our destruction. Every blow that they deal upon the bigotry and tyranny of Mexico is as beneficial to us as it is to them. So President Lamar decided to use the Texas Navy and triangulate with Yucatan to keep Mexico in line. In the summer of 1840, a Texas envoy named James Treat was negotiating with Mexico over the recognition of Texas. And because of that, the Texas Navy couldn't just go down the coast and start shooting up Mexican ships. The first mission of the new Texas Navy was diplomatic, and it was to Yucatan. In July 1840, Commodore Moore led 5 warships out of the mouth of the Mississippi River from New Orleans. The steamer Zavala left for Yucatan to take dispatches to its rebel general, while Commodore Moore met with Yucatan's governor-elect to shore up relations between Texas and Yucatan. Along the way down to the Mexican coast, he took great care to respect the personal property of the Yucatecos, who had been preyed upon by wild Texans right after the Revolution. Because Texas was negotiating with Mexico at the time, Commodore Moore knew he couldn't take any offensive action. But Lamar's orders gave him permission to go on the offense if he were fired upon, and more frequently anchored his warship just off Mexican ports to see if they would do it. He hoped that his presence further up the Mexican coast, between Veracruz in the center and the mouth of the Rio Grande on the Texas border, would draw Mexican troops away from the Federalists in Tabasco and Yucatan and help them in their fight. Around this time, the only excitement for the cruise was a hurricane, which blew through the Gulf of Mexico in October 1840, thrashing the steamer Zavala for 3 days. To keep the steamer from being driven against the shore's rocks and broken up, her skipper, Commander John T.K. Lothrop, had to run his engines at full speed, and he was low on coal. He ended up having to use up all of his coal and then break up the furniture and put it in the boiler furnaces to keep the engines running. Then he had to break up the yards on the masts and the doors and the planks of the decking, and he had to burn all of that until you could hardly walk from one end of the ship to the other. He tossed over all the cannonballs, tied ropes to the cannon, and threw them overboard to act as anchors, and barely survived. But the Zavala did survive and made it back home. Around that same time, the schooner San Jacinto was the first big loss of the Second Texas Navy. She was lost when her skipper, Lieutenant James O'Shaughnessy, anchored her too close to the rocks at the Arcos Islands in the southern Gulf of Mexico. A storm drove her against those rocks, and she became the first vessel of the Second Texas Navy to be lost. The one capture around this time was a Mexican merchant ship, the Anna Maria, captured by the schooner San Antonio, which was commanded under Commodore Moore's cousin, Lieutenant Alex Moore. But it turned out that the Mexican ship belonged to the U.S. Consul to Texas, and the papers made a big stink about it. Commodore Moore's cousin, the commander of San Antonio, ended up deserting the Navy and becoming one of the very few officers to just outright leave. Quite an embarrassment for Commodore Moore. There was another small but potent development along that 1840 cruise, and that was a military alliance between Yucatan and Texas. At the capital of Merida, the state of Yucatan decided to declare independence from Mexico, and a Yucatecan general wanted the Texas Navy to help the Federalists capture the Tabascan city of San Juan Bautista, Tabasco's capital. Commodore Moore agreed to use his steamer to tow the warships up the Tabasco River for $25,000 in cash, $10,000 up front and $15,000 in about 20 days or so. When the Texas Navy arrived on the scene, the Centralistas fighting for the Mexican central government evacuated the town. They left it to the Federalists, and Moore was paid the last $15,000, but it took a little prodding from Moore. After the town was captured, the Federalists didn't want to pay up the last $15,000, and he had to threaten to bombard the town if the money wasn't paid. They paid up. There was another result of the 1840 cruise, and that was that Texas was able to use its threat to shipping in the Gulf of Mexico to win recognition from Great Britain. Before long, bills began piling into the Texas government, which couldn't afford to pay very many of its own employees, much less a navy. As one British diplomat put it in 1840, one great fault of the Texians is that they tried to do everything at once. And having done very little, and that very badly, they imagine that they have succeeded. They contract a great debt for a navy, and having disgusted the officers they have seduced from other services by irregularity of pay and inactivity as regards service, they lay up the navy together with the officers. Well, the problem, as Texas found out, was that a navy is very different from an army. When you don't need the army, you just tell everybody to go home. You put the rifles and the cannons into a warehouse, and you call everybody back up when you need them. I mean, that's what Switzerland and Israel and to some extent the United States does. But with the Navy, you can't really send everyone home and call them back whenever you want. You can't put the ships in a warehouse. You have to care for them or they will rot. And that means you have to pay for officers and sailors, whether they're sailing against the enemy or not. When you need them back, it's going to be a lot harder to train farmers how to sail a ship than it would be to simply march in line and shoot a musket. But that's what the Texas government at the end of 1840 was facing. Secretary Cook quit his job, leaving Commander Todd in charge of the Navy Department as its acting secretary. There wasn't much for the Texas Navy to do in 1841, so Commodore Moore, not wanting to waste any time, boarded the San Antonio at Galveston Bay. He took it up and down the Texas coast on a nautical survey running from the Sabine Pass to Matagorda Bay. His maps and charts were more accurate than anything the sailors had before, and Commodore Moore saved a lot of ships by publishing his maps. Now, in late 1841, President Lamar found a novel way to help prevent another invasion of Texas by Mexico and pay for his navy. He rented it out to Yucatan. President Lamar crafted an executive order on September 18, 1841, agreeing to let his navy work with the Yucatan Navy to blockade the Mexican coast and patrol the Gulf of Mexico for the low price of nearly $8,000 per month in silver. Commodore Moore received orders to operate off the Mexican coast so long as he could do it within an $8,000 a month budget. Now, on that budget, Moore could really only get the flagship Austin and the two remaining schooners, San Bernard and San Antonio, ready. But he skedaddled out of Galveston on December 13, 1841, the day before Sam Houston would be sworn in as Texas's newly elected president for his second term. 2 days after Moore got out of Galveston, Sam Houston's new Secretary of the Navy, George W. Hockley, wrote orders for Moore directing him to return the squadron to Galveston. But the problem was he couldn't get those orders to the Commodore. Unfortunately for the Texas Navy, not only were the political currents in Texas turning against them, the political currents in Yucatan didn't help either. The Yucatecos signed a treaty agreeing to remain part of the United States of Mexico in return for some more local autonomy. So the Texas Navy did not have much of a job by early 1842. Commodore Moore sailed off the Mexican coast, capturing a merchant brig named the Progreso, and he learned that Mexico was buying warships from England so they could fight Texas. He collected his $8,000 monthly fees from Yucatan, but in March of 1842, Secretary Hockley's orders finally caught up with him. Those were the ones written back in December, and he had to return home. While Commodore Moore was prowling the Mexican coast, the one and only mutiny in the Texas Navy's career broke out aboard the 7-gun schooner San Antonio. The San Antonio had put into New Orleans and anchored off Algiers at a place called Slaughterhouse Point. Algiers is on the opposite side of the Mississippi River from the French Quarter, which has, of course, its bars and brothels and other delights. And the sailors of the San Antonio were not permitted to get off the warship for fear that they would get drunk and desert. All they could do was stand on the warship looking at a lot of people having a lot of fun in New Orleans. Well, whenever a ship goes into anchor, there's always going to be a way to smuggle liquor aboard. And on the night of February 11, 1842, the ship's commander left San Antonio in the hands of Lieutenant Charles Fuller, the son of John Fuller, who was a Washington hotel owner who had introduced the Colt revolver to the Texas government back in 1839. Talk of a mutiny had quietly circulated among the sailors, and Fuller knew he was going to have his hands full. When some drunken seamen and Marines approached the officer of the deck, named Sailing Master M.H. Dearborn, they demanded that they could go ashore. The demand was naturally refused, and Lieutenant Fuller arrived on the scene to find a small and angry mob. He called out the Marines, which was standard procedure, but one of the ringleaders of the mob was a drunken Marine sergeant named Seymour Oswald. Oswald opened up the ship's arms locker and returned with the drunken sailors and some Marines brandishing pistols, tomahawks, muskets with bayonets, and cutlasses. Oswald slashed at Lieutenant Fuller with a tomahawk, but missed. Fuller went for his pistol, but the Marines opened fire, killing Fuller with a pistol shot to the lung. 2 other midshipmen were wounded as they tried to defend their lieutenant, and they were all locked down below decks as the mutineers rowed over to the French Quarter in the ship's longboats. Local authorities and some Marines from the U.S. revenue cutter Jackson heard the commotion and quickly rounded up most of the conspirators. They put them in a local jail for now. Lieutenant Fuller's body, which is now in the Texas State Cemetery, was buried at the Girard Street Cemetery, which is now covered up by the parking lot for the Louisiana Superdome. It's an irony that the only fatality of a Texas mutiny was a man killed by a Colt revolver, which his father had introduced to Texas. Around that time, Commodore Moore took the Austin down to the town of Carmen on what's now called the Mayan Riviera. Commodore Moore wanted to give his sailors a break, but they did what tourists have done for centuries in that part of Mexico. They went into the local bars, they got drunk, and they got into fights with the locals. The fights turned into a riot, and one seaman from the San Bernard was killed. Commodore Moore, hearing the ruckus, waded into the mob and knocked seamen and locals aside, and he bellowed out that he would burn the town to the ground if the locals didn't leave his men alone. He had his Marines and officers gather up his men and shove the drunkards back into the ship, and he got out of there. By this point, and we're now into early 1842, Commodore Moore had to return home as ordered. On the way back, he captured 3 more Mexican vessels, but that didn't really matter. He had to come home. Around the time that Commodore Moore got back to Galveston on April 1st, 1842, the Mexican army had sent General Rafael Vasquez with 600 regulars to sack San Antonio. The Texas government ordered Commodore Moore to blockade the Mexican coast, but he had no money to do it with, and the Texas government couldn't give him any money to hire sailors. He used some of his personal credit to pay his sailors, but without real money from either Yucatan or Texas, he couldn't do much. Well, throughout 1842, President Sam Houston, back in office, had made no secret of his dislike for the Texas Navy. In part, that was because he really didn't understand it. And in part, it was because when the Navy went to sea, the president could no longer control it. Now, Houston thought that the best way to defend Texas's coastline was to erect big artillery batteries, forgetting, I guess, that Texas had over 500 miles of coast where the enemy could land, and he would never have enough cannons to defend everything. Houston ordered the Navy to attack, but he wouldn't release payment of $20,000 in exchequer bills, which were basically promises to pay, that the Texas Congress had appropriated. And even when the Texas Congress appropriated payments to the Texas Navy specifically, Houston wouldn't release the money. Eventually, Sam Houston decided to get rid of Commodore Moore. He gave him the $20,000 in exchequer bills, and he said, I only want you to use those as collateral for a loan. And I want you to promise that you can sail against Texas if I give you this as collateral. Commodore Moore found this to be impossible, since Texas bills had very little worth in the market. They were, as I said, the junk bonds. And so when he couldn't go move against Mexico, Houston decided that Commodore Moore had disobeyed orders and he would court-martial the Commodore. Well, at this point, there wasn't a lot to the Texas Navy anyway. The Zavala, by this time, summer of 1842, lay rotting in Galveston's harbor, and it was obvious that she would never sail again. The brigs Archer and Wharton had not yet sailed against Mexico, and after the return trip following the mutiny, the San Antonio disappeared, never to be seen again. It was rumored that she had become a slave ship, and there were other rumors that she had become a ghost ship. She was last seen, so people had said, near the Isle of Pines off the coast of Cuba. But the ultimate fate of the San Antonio was a mystery that died with the last of her crewmen. Even worse for Texas in late 1842 was the Mexican Navy's revival. Mexico bought a steamboat named the City of Dublin and recommissioned her as the steamer Regenerador. They bought a 7-gun schooner named Aguila, a 17-gun brig named Yucateco, a 9-gun brig named Iman, a 3-gun schooner called Sicilino, and worst of all, 2 massive steamers armed and armor-plated, the Guadalupe and the Moctezuma. The Guadalupe boasted 2 68-pounder Paxane guns. These were guns that fired 68-pound explosive shells. and she had 2 long-range 32-pounders that fired cannonballs. Built in Liverpool, England, she was the largest iron-plated vessel in the world and became the first steam-powered warship to cross the Atlantic Ocean. She was captained by Royal Navy Commander E.P. Charlwood and had about 80 British sailors on leave making money as their side hustle. The Moctezuma had 2 68-pounder guns and 6 42-pounder guns. She weighed 1,100 tons and had the heaviest armament in the Gulf. Commander Richard Cleveland, also a Royal Navy officer, commanded the ship with a mixed crew of Spaniards, Britons, and Mexicans. Either of these steam-powered monsters would have been more than a match for what was left of the Texas Navy. Meanwhile, Zavala, San Bernard, and the brig Archer were sitting in Galveston, slowly rotting from lack of upkeep. The Austin and the brig Wharton would have joined them, except that they were in New Orleans, and Commodore Moore was using his personal credit to try to pay for carpenters, food suppliers, and sailors. Sam Houston didn't care about any of that. He had a lot of myopia when it came to naval strategy. He told his Secretary of War and Navy, George Washington Hill, to order Commodore Moore to return from New Orleans, where Houston was either going to fire him or order him to do just nothing with the Navy. Well, Moore lacked the money to take a ship back home, or so he said, so he sat in New Orleans while Sam Houston played a political game. Houston told the Texas Congress in January 1843 that Mexico was about ready to invade Texas, and he let the United States and Britain know that too. He was probably hoping that fear of British influence would persuade President John Tyler to annex Texas, or at least protect Texas, and he implied to Britain that he would have to turn to the United States if Britain didn't make Mexico stand down. But President Houston didn't want to use a navy. That was not part of his strategy. He instead asked the Texas Congress to pass a secret bill selling the naval ships and sending agents to New Orleans to get the Wharton and the Austin back to Galveston so they too could be sold. Houston appointed James Morgan, William Bryan, and Samuel May Williams to go retrieve the vessels from New Orleans. Well, Samuel May Williams had financed the original Texas Navy during the Revolution, and he refused to go. But James Morgan and William Bryan left with orders for the Texas Navy's commander to take all subsequent orders from the commissioners, James Morgan and William Bryan. They effectively commanded the Texas Navy. Well, the two commissioners arrived in New Orleans thinking they would find a broken down old group of ships. But the two ships there, the Austin and the Wharton, were in really prime shape at the time. It turns out that the Yucatecos had been invaded by the Centralistas, so they sent Commodore Moore another $8,000 in silver to continue the bargain that Texas had made under President Lamar. That pact had not been repudiated formally after Houston took office. So the ships and the men looked like they were in great shape, and Commodore Moore explained to the two commissioners how Texas was in mortal danger if the Centralistas were able to pacify Yucatan. They would use their new navy and their larger army to move against Texas, probably in the spring of 1843. James Morgan, the lead commissioner, thought about that. When he heard news from other merchant vessels coming from Mexico that Yucatan was under siege by a Centralist army, he told Commodore Moore that he would come home to Texas aboard the ships, but they would both go home by way of Yucatan. Well, the Texas Navy left New Orleans on the evening of April 19, 1843. Before it moved against Mexico, it had one bit of unpleasant business to go over. Before the fleet left, Commodore Moore's officers picked up the San Antonio mutineers from a New Orleans prison and had them tried before a court-martial. One of the men was acquitted. 3 were sentenced to between 50 and 100 lashes, and 4 were condemned to death. Well, a little bit later, one man received 50 lashes. Nobody else was whipped, though. The 4 mutineers, a Marine private, a Marine corporal, and 2 seamen, were hanged from the foreyard of the Austin for an hour until they were dead, then buried at sea. The Texas Navy arrived off the coast of Yucatan on April 30th, 1843, and engaged a larger Mexican squadron that day. The two fleets played a game of cat and mouse for 2 weeks. The Texas fleet was more aggressive, and it could take shelter near the castle of Campeche on Yucatan's Gulf Coast. But the Mexican fleet had bigger guns, more of them, and most importantly, it had steam power. The two sides fought again on the 16th of May, 1843. This time, both big ships traded shots, and both injured each other a little bit, but in the end, the Mexican fleet drew off. Without naval support, the Mexican army besieging Campeche could not keep fighting, and Yucatan was saved, and Texas was spared another invasion. Well, Commodore Moore would have loved to stay and savor his victory at Campeche. But while he was away, President Houston issued a proclamation declaring Commodore Moore and his officers to be pirates. Houston called on the powers of Christendom to apprehend the scoundrels and bring them to Texas for justice. Commodore Moore knew he was obeying the orders of Commissioner James Morgan, the man Sam Houston had put in charge of the squadron. So he immediately sailed home in the Austin with the Wharton by his side to clear his name. His ship weighed anchor in Galveston, where they were hailed as heroes, and the citizens offered them banquets in their honor. Well, the Commodore promptly went to the local sheriff, where he announced that he had read Sam Houston's proclamation and he would place himself under arrest. Now, the sheriff, of course, wasn't an idiot. He wasn't about to arrest a war hero, so he just said he didn't have any jurisdiction over the matter. Well, at the end of May, President Houston fired the officers of the Texas Navy. Houston tried to fire Moore without a court-martial, but that wasn't legal under Texas law, so he had to convene a court-martial. And the court-martial court basically acquitted Commodore Moore, so he kept his rank. But Houston's government refused to accept the findings of the court-martial, so Commodore Moore had to wage a public battle with Sam Houston to clear his name. He never got the satisfaction of the Texas government admitting he had been right. The Texas government also tried to get rid of the Navy ships with less success. In accordance with the secret law passed in January 1843, in October of that year, they tried to auction off the brig Archer, the schooner San Antonio, and the engines from the Zavala. But the good people of Galveston, knowing that they would be on the front line of any invasion, formed a mob. They threatened to lynch anyone who tried to buy the Texas Navy. The ships ended up being sold for some sham bids in the name of the Republic of Texas, and they remained in Galveston Bay, where they continued to rot. The Navy's end came in 1846. Texas was annexed into the United States late the year before, and the following May, the agents from the United States came to get all of Texas' stuff. They replaced the Texas ensign aboard the flagship with the Stars and Stripes, and they towed the Austin off to Pensacola, Florida, where it became a training ship until she was struck off the U.S. Navy's rolls. Commodore Moore and his officers tried to argue that when the United States took over the Texas Navy, it had to take over the Texas Navy's officers too. Of course, the U.S. Navy's officers didn't want to see the Texians pass them by in promotion, so they lobbied Congress while another officer took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the end, Congress settled the matter by paying off the Texas officers and cutting off any further claims they had to service or rank in the United States Navy. So that is the story of the Texas Navy. It went in with a bang, with high hopes from the Lamar government, and went out with a whimper. We thank you for joining us.
John, thank you very much for your presentation this evening. It was absolutely fantastic. Now, a little bit earlier, we went on social media and we invited members of the public, people who are interested in Texas Navy, to submit questions to ask after this. So would you be available to answer a few questions now?
I'd love to. Thanks, Andy.
Okay. The first question is, this is kind of a fun one. if you could do a sit-down, face-to-face interview with either Edwin Moore, Sam Houston, or Santa Anna, which would you choose and why?
I love it. I think probably Sam Houston of all those three. I mean, he was the enemy, the nemesis of the Texas Navy, so I shouldn't like the guy. But he had a long-term view of the relationship between Texas and the United States. He was a unionist, and he never wanted Texas to join the Confederacy. He had a very good sense of leadership, even if he was myopic when it came to naval strategy. So Santa Anna was a veteran of a lot more wars and intrigues and revolutions than Houston was. But I think Sam Houston had a little bit more political complexity. There's a good example where I read once that when he would sign his name in cursive, Sam Houston, with the cursive letter S, he would sometimes scrunch the letter S so it almost looked like he was writing, I am Houston. And that was just one of many ways that he liked to intimidate people. So he was an interesting political boss. And so I'd say Sam Houston.
Okay, that's a great answer. I've heard that story too. So yeah, he did not suffer from a sense of being a small guy.
Exactly.
Okay, another question. What was Commodore Moore's biggest misjudgment or misstep?
Gosh. Okay, again, my biases come in, like everybody's do. I didn't see that many missteps that Commodore Moore made that were very big. He was not in a good position after the Lamar administration because he didn't have any allies. So I think, if anything, his biggest mistake was probably not spending more time schmoozing Sam Houston. Houston, I think he was a reasonable guy, very headstrong, and he didn't like the Navy. But Houston really needed some education on naval strategy. These questions about using a fight somewhere else to protect you at home, that's come up ever since the times of the Greeks against the Persians. And so I think Commodore Moore's biggest mistake was probably not doing enough to work up a relationship with Sam Houston. It might not have helped in the end, but I think if that would be the only place I'd fault him. He was an exemplary commander in virtually all other respects.
Okay, thank you. Here's one. Did the Texas Navy or the Texas Army have Paxan guns like the Mexicans did? And if not, and the Texas Navy had been destroyed at the Battle of Campeche, would that have left the Texas open to being invaded? Would the Mexican Army, would the Mexican Navy have used those ships to shell Galveston?
I think go into the first part of it. The Texas Navy did not have those big shell firing guns. There was a group of shell firing Paxan cannon that Sam Houston had looked at buying for coastal defense and concluded they were just too expensive. But if the Texas Navy had lost in May of 1843 off the coast of Yucatan at Campeche, there probably would have been some large-scale raids on Texas for certain. Remember, by 1843, though, we were now into the administration of John Tyler, Mr. Manifest Destiny. And he was the one pushing for the annexation of Texas. So I think there is a decent chance that he would have sent in troops from the Louisiana district nearby to help defend Texas. So in the end, probably there would have been some shelling by Mexico. There would have been some raids. Whether they could have taken and held Mexico would be very tricky. I think the only thing Mexico would have had going for it at the time is that President Tyler, kind of being an accidental president, didn't have a whole lot of support from his own party. But I think Tyler would have wanted to use a Mexican invasion of Texas in the same way that the Nueces Strip became our cause for war in the Mexican War a few years later.
Thank you. So here's another question. The U.S. Navy during this same time period had fairly significant numbers of African American and Afro-Caribbean sailors. Did the Texas Navy?
That is a wonderful question, and it's hard to pin down a real answer to that. I've looked back through the muster rolls to try to find at least some of them. Certainly, there were African and Afro-Caribbeans who had been enslaved. John Grant Todd, for instance, had a slave and who had a free wife who was his cook. There were some so-called, servants in air quotes, who were in human bondage. But as far as free sailors go, it is very difficult to tell. Most likely there were some, and there was a newspaper report about a black deserter from the Texas Navy. But the records for the Navy are very difficult to make that out. They just didn't keep that kind of information. So the short answer is yes, there had to have been some. They were recruited from places like New York and New Orleans, and you had sailors from all around the world. But identifying how many there were is very difficult.
Okay, thank you. So what was the strangest or oddest aspect of one of these historical figures that you discovered that surprised you the most?
I think among these figures, probably the intellectual curiosity of Commodore Moore was the biggest. Moore, as I said earlier, spoke Spanish. He had designed an improved lifeboat that actually helped in one of the near shipwreck, one of the ships that they were saving from off the Mexican coast. He charted the Texas coastline and prepared these charts that were used to reduce insurance costs for Texas merchants. He was a skilled diplomat. He got along very well with the Yucatan governor-elect, the governor and their generals and their port commandants. And he knew everything there was to know about sailing a warship in the Gulf of Mexico. He was a forceful writer, though not an especially gifted one, and was very charming and sociable in New Orleans and Virginia society. So the multifaceted side of this guy, who was really just kind of a naval commander, surprised me. It's kind of like Jack Aubrey in the Patrick O'Brian novels. You see a lot of different sides of him. I thought that was fascinating to learn about.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, John. This has been a great evening. We really appreciate your taking time to join us. On behalf of the Texas Navy Association and the Seminars Committee, I would like to thank you for donating your time and effort to this. We greatly appreciate it and always enjoy working with you. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, Andy. Thank you.
As you would expect, we have some thank yous. First and foremost, the award-winning author Jonathan Jordan, our presenter tonight. We also want to thank our sponsor, the Texas Maritime Museum. You need to go visit the Texas Maritime Museum. We want to thank our Seminars Committee and thank the Texas Navy Association. And you can find information about the Texas Navy at texasnavy.org.